Hi everyone, I'm Matt Murphy, Tour Program Supervisor at Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site. Wawa Welcome America is virtual this year, but we wanted to make sure that you could still see our incredible site and learn about our incredible history. I'm standing on the threshold to Cellblock 7. Cellblock 7 is one of the oldest parts of Eastern State. It's almost 200 years old. It's completed around 1836. And as we step inside, I'm going to show you some of Eastern State's incredible architecture. We're going to step into a cell, and we'll talk about the prison's early years. Follow me. Now take a second to look up and look around. You'll notice that the cell block has high arched ceilings, kind of like a cathedral. There's about 1,000 skylights in the building. Visitors are often surprised by how illuminated the building is. The man who designed the place was an architect from England, John Haviland, and he thought that a penitentiary should resemble a cathedral, that it should inspire reflection and soul searching. So let's continue down the cell block. We're going to step into a cell about halfway down. All along your right and your left, you'll see cells about every 6 feet. Now, when Eastern State opened in 1829, it was the most famous prison in the world. It was the most expensive prison that had ever been built. And it was completely unprecedented. No one ever built a place quite like Eastern State. Eastern State was designed to reform people, to rehabilitate people. And the way they did that was through solitary confinement. They had a name for this idea. It was called the Pennsylvania system. And this system became famous all over the world. But keeping people in solitary confinement for years on end put a lot of demands on the building. So everything about Eastern State, the way it was designed, the way the guards ran the building, was meant to support a life of solitary confinement. So we'll learn more about that when we step into the cells. We're going to step into cell 46 here on my left. Come on in. The cells are pretty large for prisons of the day. In fact, they're kind of large for prison cells today in Pennsylvania. But that's because prisoners were essentially living their whole lives, 23 hours of a day, inside of one of these cells. So there had to be a little bit of room. Prisoners under the Pennsylvania system were expected to work in their cell, eat in their cell, sleep in their cell, meet with instructors in their cell. Labor was a very important part of life under the Pennsylvania system. If prisoners didn't have a trade or a job that they could perform in their cells when they arrived, they would be taught one by a guard. Guards were hired from the ranks of skilled tradespeople. Shoemaking, chair making, weaving were very common trades. The things the prisoners made were sold to fund the prison and also hopefully offer some kind of job training and make prisoners less likely to break the law when they got out so that they could have a job. Now, the only break from the cell was 30 minutes in the morning and 30 minutes in the afternoon in what was known as a solitary exercise yard. Now, most of the exercise yards are gone today, they don't exist anymore, but we can see the remnants of the passageway that would have led from a cell into the exercise yard. So try to think of this as kind of like a second cell, but with no roof, basically affording prisoners a chance to get some fresh air and some sunlight. But that was essentially it. Life was pretty plain. This was a pretty controversial system, and it had a lot of critics. Men like Charles Dickens, the famous English author, visited Eastern State, and they saw something really problematic happening here. They thought that solitary confinement was doing serious damage to the mental and physical health of the prisoners. And based on what we know about solitary confinement today, he might have been right in some ways. Solitary confinement continues today. There's about 80,000 people in some form of solitary in the United States. So did it work? Did keeping hundreds of people in solitary confinement all the time rehabilitate people the way they thought it would? We're not sure. The first prisoner was a young man, 18 years old when he arrived. His name was Charles Williams. He was doing a 2-year sentence for burglary, and he was the first of about 85,000 people to walk through the door as a prisoner. Charles learned how to make shoes while he was here. One observer said he was making 10 really nice pairs of shoes a week, and that he was reading regularly from the Bible, and everybody had high hopes for Charles. Charles got out. Charles came back a few years later for the same crime, so he had recidivated. It's hard to say overall if this prison did any better job than any other prison at the time of rehabilitating people. Based on what we know about solitary confinement, maybe not. So we're going to go back into the cell block, and our next stop will be the central rotunda. We'll talk a little bit more about Eastern State's architecture and the way they maintain security here. We're now standing outside of Eastern State Penitentiary's central surveillance hub, arguably the most important room of the building. Follow me. Eastern State was originally laid out on what was known as the radial plan. What that meant is that the first 7 cell blocks shot out from this room like the spokes of a wheel. Many early observers often called it the wagon wheel design. This is a highly influential design. About 300 prisons all over the world copy Eastern State's radial plan. So that's part of why we call it America's most historic prison. Why don't you step into the center of the room and try it out? The idea was that if a guard didn't see any prisoners, everything was going great. Prisoners were supposed to be inside of their cells, working, meeting with instructors, sleeping. So it's kind of a weird security philosophy. You don't see any prisoners, everything is okay. Now things changed. Going into the 20th century, Eastern State's population grew dramatically, to the point where they couldn't keep everyone alone in solitary confinement. The Pennsylvania system, which had become famous all over the world, was abandoned in the year 1913. After that, the prison became a congregate facility, kind of the way we think of prisons today. All right, we learned about security at Eastern State in the 19th century. At our next stop, we're going to learn about security in the 20th century. In the early 1920s, a modern guard tower was added above the center rotunda, and it's kind of a scary climb, so I'm going to let you go first. Go up those steps. It's a pretty strenuous climb. We've got a little bit more to go. I'm going to open up this old security door from the mid-20th century. You first. Almost there. Just one more set of steps, and then we're going to get a really good view. The guard would have been stationed in one of the 5 guard towers around the clock. It was a pretty boring job. Most times, nothing happened. But there were guards up here who were responsible for preventing escapes, noticing if there was a disaster like a fire. So it could be a stressful job. They had to check in with another guard on the ground about every 15 minutes. Let's step out on the catwalk, take in the view. From up here, you can really see how much Eastern State changed over time. The building started with just 7 cell blocks. It could hold about 450 prisoners. But by the time it closed in 1971, there were 15 cell blocks, so it doubled in size. At its peak, the prison would hold 1,800 prisoners. That was 1931. So life was very different at that point. Philadelphia was also originally about 1.5 miles to the southeast. As time passed, Philadelphia grew and grew and kind of swallowed up the penitentiary. Now we're basically in Center City. Now the view up here really shows how much Eastern State Penitentiary changed over time. The building was originally a pretty small prison by today's standards. It only had about 7 cell blocks. It could hold about 450 prisoners. But that changed dramatically over time. In 71, there were 15 cell blocks. At its peak, the prison held 1,800 prisoners at once. That was in 1931. This is also a great place, though, to talk about escapes. Follow me. Now behind me is Eastern State's Gothic castle-like facade. It's also the site of Eastern State's first escape. Now there are about 100 escapes, but I think the first one is my favorite. A prisoner named William Hamilton was being used kind of like a servant by the warden, Samuel Wood. The warden lived in an apartment in that castle-like structure. And one day, William Hamilton was left alone and apparently stole a bunch of the warden's stuff. He made a 60-foot-long rope out of bed sheets and bed cord, climbed all the way to the top of that central tower, and then rappelled down using his rope, kind of like a SWAT team member, and disappeared out into Philadelphia. He was caught, he came back, did his time, left, came back again to Eastern State for a separate crime, and he would escape again in almost the exact same way. So I think that's a really incredible escape, and it would be the first of about 100. Now I'm going to invite you to explore a little bit on your own. Why don't you take a lap around the guard tower and get a sense of the building. We're inside of Cellblock 15. Cellblock 15 was the last cell block constructed at Eastern State, completed in 1959. So that makes it the most modern part of Eastern State's facility. It has a design that you could see in a modern Pennsylvania prison. It has electronic locks, more modern crash gates. So it's got a very different feel than some of the other cell blocks we've seen. Cellblock 15 was built with 2 jobs in mind. One, it served as solitary confinement for prisoners who broke prison rules, so they were being punished by being removed from the rest of the population. 2, it housed prisoners awaiting the death penalty. No prisoners were ever executed at Eastern State Penitentiary. In the 19th century, executions were done either publicly or in county jails. Starting in 1915, executions were carried out at a different prison called Rockfield. That's ostensibly where executions would take place today. Now in the big picture, Cellblock 15 represents Eastern State's dramatic shift from its original intentions. The founders of Eastern State hoped that all prisoners could be reformed or rehabilitated and re-enter society. But now we're staying in a cell block with really the exact opposite intention. It housed people that were never getting out of prison. In fact, the state of Pennsylvania was going to execute them for their crimes. So a complete turnaround for the institution. Eastern State was designed to be an improvement upon the disease-filled prisons of the 18th century, but in reality, it was probably not a very healthy place to live. Eastern State was ravaged by several diseases, the most deadly of them, tuberculosis. It's responsible for about half of all prisoner deaths at Eastern State. We counted about 600 so far. So we're actually inside of a solarium cell. Think of it as like a sunroom cell. Designed to let in lots of fresh air and sunlight. Before antibiotics, those were the primary ways to treat the disease. Now we know today that that's not very effective, but this is the era before antibiotics. Today, we're seeing something similar happening inside of prisons today in the United States. Coronavirus is ravaging the US prison population. Prisoners are one of the most at-risk demographics for the disease. Prison officials are reacting by finding new ways to enforce social distancing. There are calls for mass releases of prisoners who don't serve a public safety risk. But there is also controversy. Prisoners are being used to create PPE and to manufacture hand sanitizer. And the controversy here is that prisoners often are not allowed to use these products because of the alcohol content. And they're also being put into unsafe working conditions. So it hasn't been resolved. We're not exactly sure how it'll play out, so stay tuned. We're outside of Al Capone's cell right now. Al Capone was definitely the most famous prisoner at Eastern State. He came to Eastern State in the spring of 1929. Capone was traveling from Atlantic City, New Jersey, heading home to Chicago, Illinois, and he stopped in Philadelphia to catch a connecting train. He had a little time to kill, so he went to see a movie. Somehow, Philadelphia detectives were aware of his presence in the city, and on his way out of the theater, he was stopped and frisked by police. They found an unlicensed .38 caliber revolver on him. His bodyguard had one too. So they're both arrested and convicted of carrying a concealed deadly weapon. Capone received the maximum sentence, 1 year. He went to Holmesburg County Jail in Northeast Philadelphia first for about 2 months, and then was transferred to Eastern State Penitentiary, we believe, for security purposes. Why don't we step into his cell, and we'll talk about what happened to Capone once he got to Eastern State. Now, Al Capone was a very wealthy, a very powerful, and a very famous man. He was the head of a huge organized crime outfit in Chicago during Prohibition. So he was one of America's biggest bootleggers. And some people think that Capone was living better than some of the other people incarcerated at Eastern State. A local newspaper wrote a story about Capone's lavish cell, saying that he was living in luxury. His cell was bigger than some of the other cells. He had 2 skylights. His cell was located near the guards, so he had extra security. The part of the building that the cell was located in was known as Park Avenue, apparently. Now, that's a great story, but we're not really sure how true it is. Records show that throughout Eastern State's history, prisoners were able to decorate their cells, putting personal belongings on the wall, making things, buying and selling from each other. The prison also eventually had a commissary, like a little shop, that sold authorized items that prisoners could buy using the wages from their work inside the prison. So whether Capone was treated differently or not is kind of a history mystery. And if he was treated differently, how much, we don't really know. It's interesting to think about how people might be treated inside of prisons today based on celebrity status or if they have more money than other people. Capone was eventually released early for good behavior. He did 7.5 months total at Eastern State. His release was kind of a big deal. They staged a secret release at Graterford Prison, about 35 miles northwest of Philadelphia. A huge group of people trying to catch a glimpse of the famous celebrity gangster formed outside the penitentiary, and Warden Herbert Smith had to go outside and shoo away looky-loos to make sure they understood that he had been transferred out. Capone would be free for about 2 more years before being arrested again by the federal government for tax evasion, and that would send him on a tour of the federal prison system for nearly 8 years. Capone was eventually released from the federal system and lived another 8 years before dying in his home outside of Miami, Florida, from complications related to neurosyphilis. Eastern State Penitentiary closed after 142 years of operation in 1971. The prison was then abandoned for over 20 years before it became a museum in 1994. Today we're committed to hosting conversations around the legacy of American criminal justice reform. Behind me is an exhibit we call the Big Graph, and it shows us the increasing rate of incarceration in the United States over the last century. Now 1970 is red because that's approximately the year that Eastern State closed, but also because this is the beginning point of a number of changes to the American criminal justice system. Changes like the war on drugs, the war on crime, that dramatically increased the rate of incarceration in the United States. In a 40-year period, there was a 600% growth in the US prison population. Today, at any given time, there's about 2.2 million Americans inside of a prison cell. This is the highest rate of incarceration in the world. When we reopen, we hope that you'll come take a tour for real, and we can have a conversation about the history of Eastern State and what it means today. In the meantime, you can learn more at our website, easternstate.org. Thanks for joining me.